Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the weeds on a super important topic, antihypertensive drugs. We're going through the source material you sent, pulling out the key stuff from pharmacology and the nursing process.
Yeah, the goal is to make this complex chapter feel, a lot clearer.
Absolutely. And it needs to be clear because, wow, hypertension affects so many people.
It really does. It's the most common disease state globally. We're talking over 1 billion people. And the tricky part is it's often the silent killer. No symptoms, but it's a huge risk factor for stroke, heart failure, kidney failure, really serious stuff.
Okay, so when we talk about hypertension, what numbers are we actually looking at? Let's stick to the JNC8 criteria from the sources.
Right, so kind of depends on the patient. For folks over 60, the threshold is generally a systolic pressure of 150 or higher, or a diastolic of 90 or higher, persistently, of course.
And for younger patients, under 60, or those with other conditions like kidney disease or diabetes.
For them, the target is a bit lower. We're looking at a systolic of 140 or more, or a diastolic of 90 plus.
Got it. So different thresholds, but the main mission of treatment is the same, right?
Exactly. No matter the age, the whole point of antihypertensive therapy is to reduce the long-term risk of damage to the heart, brain, kidneys. Basically, cutting down cardiovascular and renal morbidity and mortality.
So how do the drugs actually do that? The sources break down blood pressure pretty simply.
Yeah, it's basically an equation. Blood pressure equals cardiac output times systemic vascular resistance.
Okay, unpack those a bit. Cardiac output is...
That's just the amount of blood your heart pumps out,
Yeah.
specifically from the left ventricle each minute.
And systemic vascular resistance, SVR.
That's basically how tight or relaxed your blood vessels are throughout the body. Think of it like the resistance the blood faces as it flows. So all the drugs we'll talk about,
Yeah.
they work by tweaking one or both of those factors, the pump or the pipes, you could say.
Makes sense. And there are quite a few ways to do that. The sources list 7 main categories.
Yep. We've got diuretics, adrenergic drugs, vasodilators, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, calcium channel blockers, CCBs, and direct renin inhibitors. Quite the list.
Let's start with the ones that target the nervous system, the adrenergic drugs. That's a big category.
It is. These drugs are all about modifying the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS. That's your body's fight or flight response. Normally, the SNS ramps up blood pressure by making the heart beat faster and harder and by constricting blood vessels.
So these drugs kind of put the brakes on that system?
Precisely. They interfere with those signals.
Sure.
And they do it in different places. Let's talk about the ones that work centrally first, like clonidine or methyldopa.
Centrally meaning in the brain.
Exactly. They stimulate specific receptors in the brain, the alpha-2 receptors, which actually inhibit the sympathetic signals going out to the rest of the body. So less norepinephrine gets produced, the heart might slow down a bit, vessels relax, and it even reduces renin activity down in the kidneys.
Okay, hang on. If it's working centrally like that, shutting it down, what happens if someone just stops taking it?
You've hit the major safety warning for these guys. Rebound hypertension.
Meaning the blood pressure shoots way up.
Dangerously high, potentially. If you abruptly stop clonidine, that central brake is suddenly released and the sympathetic system can go into overdrive. It's a huge risk. That's why, like most antihypertensives, really, you never just stop them cold. They need to be tapered off carefully.
Good to know. Okay, so that's central. What about the peripheral adrenergic drugs, like the alpha-1 blockers, doxazosin, prazosin?
Right, so these work out in the periphery directly on the blood vessels. They block the alpha-1 receptors on arteries and veins. Blocking those receptors causes the vessels to dilate or widen.
Which lowers the resistance, the SVR part of the equation.
Exactly. Less resistance, lower pressure. And these alpha-1 blockers have a kind of interesting side gig, too.
Oh, yeah.
They're also used to treat symptoms of benign prostatic hyperplasia, BPH. They relax the smooth muscle in the prostate and bladder neck, which helps improve urine flow. So kind of useful for older guys with both high blood pressure and BPH.
Okay, but there must be a downside. Is there a big warning with these two?
Yes, definitely. The big one is first dose syncope.
Syncope as in fainting.
That first dose can cause such significant vasodilation that blood pressure drops really quickly, and the person can actually lose consciousness. It's a pretty dramatic effect.
Wow. So
Yeah.
how do you manage that?
Well, standard practice is often to have the patient take that very first dose right at bedtime, so if they do get dizzy or hypotensive, they're already lying down.
Makes sense. Anything else specific about, say, doxazosin?
Yeah, there's a little clinical pearl for the extended release form. The pill is designed so the medication gets absorbed slowly, but the empty shell, the matrix, might pass out in the stool. Patients need to know that's normal and doesn't mean the drug didn't work.
Good tip. Okay, still in the adrenergic category. Let's hit the beta blockers. Metoprolol is a common one.
Right. Beta blockers are workhorses. Their main action is blocking beta-1 receptors, primarily found in the heart. This slows down the heart rate and reduces how forcefully it contracts, lowering cardiac output. They also have a secondary effect of reducing renin secretion from the kidneys.
And some do even more, right? The dual action ones?
Yeah, drugs like labetalol and carvedilol, they block both beta-1 receptors and alpha-1 receptors. So you get the heart rate reduction plus vasodilation from the alpha blockade. Kind of the best of both worlds there.
But there's a major caution with some beta blockers, specifically the non-selective ones.
The huge one. Non-selective beta blockers block both beta-1 and beta-2 receptors. Beta-2 receptors are found in the lungs, and blocking them can cause bronchoconstriction, tightening of the airways.
So a definite no-go for patients with asthma or other lung conditions.
Absolutely contraindicated. You'd stick with a cardioselective beta blocker like metoprolol in those patients.
Okay, looking across all these adrenergic drugs, central, alpha, beta, what are some common side effects people should be aware of, besides the big warnings we mentioned?
Well, things like dizziness, fatigue, and orthostatic hypotension, that lightheadedness when you stand up, are pretty common. Dry mouth can happen, especially with the central ones. But honestly, the one that often causes the most trouble with adherence is sexual dysfunction.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one for quality of life.
It's a major reason people stop taking their meds, across many antihypertensive classes, unfortunately. It's crucial to talk about it.
Okay, let's pivot to another major system the body uses to regulate blood pressure. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAAS. This is where the ACE inhibitors come in, right? The prils.
Yep. Drugs like captopril, enalapril, lisinopril, the prils, they're incredibly important. They work by inhibiting angiotensin-converting enzyme. That's ACE.
And what does ACE normally do?
ACE converts angiotensin the first, which is relatively weak, into angiotensin the second, which is a really potent vasoconstrictor. It squeezes blood vessels like crazy. Angiotensin the second also tells the adrenal glands to release aldosterone.
Aldosterone, that makes you retain salt and water.
Exactly. So by blocking ACE, these inhibitors stop the formation of angiotensin the second. Result: less vasoconstriction and less sodium and water retention because aldosterone levels drop. Both lower blood pressure.
Plus, there's that bradykinin effect, too, isn't there?
Right. ACE also normally breaks down bradykinin, which is actually a vasodilator. So when you inhibit ACE, bradykinin levels go up, contributing a bit more to the vasodilation.
These drugs also have some pretty significant protective effects beyond just lowering BP, don't they? Especially for the heart and kidneys.
They really do. They're known to be cardioprotective. After a heart attack, they can help prevent ventricular remodeling that's harmful, changes in the heart shape and function. That makes them a cornerstone of therapy post-MI.
And the kidneys.
Also protective there. They reduce pressure within the glomeruli, the filtering units of the kidney. This is a huge benefit, especially for patients with diabetes who are already at high risk for kidney damage. That's why ACE inhibitors are often first-choice drugs for hypertensive patients with diabetes.
Are there differences between the ACE inhibitors themselves, like how they're processed?
Yeah, a key difference is that most ACE inhibitors, like enalapril, are prodrugs. They need to be converted into their active form by the liver.
Meaning if someone has liver problems.
It could be an issue. But captopril and lisinopril are exceptions. They're already active as administered, so they might be better choices for patients with significant liver dysfunction. Oh, and enalaprils are the only one available in an IV form, which is useful in hypertensive crises.
Okay, but they're not perfect. What are the key side effects to watch for with ACE inhibitors?
The most characteristic one is that dry, non-productive, persistent cough.
That's the bradykinin effect, right?
Exactly. That buildup of bradykinin is thought to cause it. It can be really bothersome for some people. Also, because they reduce aldosterone, you have to watch for hyperkalemia, high potassium levels. And then there's angioedema.
That sounds serious.
It is. It's rare, but it's potentially life-threatening swelling, often around face, lips, tongue, throat. It's a medical emergency if it happens.
One more point on ACEs. There's a note in the sources about effectiveness in different populations.
Yes, an important clinical pearl. Black patients often have what's called low renin hypertension, and generally ACE inhibitors, and also the next class, ARBs, tend to be less effective as single drug therapy for them compared to, say, thiazide diuretics or calcium channel blockers. They often need combination therapy.
Okay, so let's talk about that next class. The angiotensin the second receptor blockers, or ARBs, the sartans like losartan.
Right. ARBs achieve a similar end result to ACE inhibitors, but they work one step down the cascade. Instead of blocking the production of angiotensin II, they block angiotensin II from binding to its receptors, specifically the AT1 receptors.
So angiotensin second is still floating around, but it just can't do its job of constricting vessels and releasing aldosterone.
Precisely. It can't lock into its receptor. The big advantage here compared to ACE inhibitors?
No.
Generally, yes. Because they don't interfere with bradykinin metabolism, that annoying dry cough is much, much less common with ARBs. That's often why someone might be switched from an ACE to an ARB.
But do they share some of the same risks as ACE inhibitors?
They do. They still carry that black box warning regarding fetal toxicity, definitely not for use during pregnancy. And the risks of hyperkalemia and potential renal impairment are similar to ACE inhibitors as well.
Okay, moving on. What about diuretics? The sources mention thiazide diuretics, like hydrochlorothiazide, are often considered first line. Why is that?
Thiazides like hydrochlorothiazide or clothalidone are effective, generally well tolerated, and inexpensive. They primarily work by increasing salt and water excretion by the kidneys. This reduces the volume of fluid in the bloodstream plasma volume and extracellular fluid volume, which decreases preload on the heart and eventually leads to a decrease in SVR2. Simple, effective volume reduction.
Makes sense. Then we have the drugs that just directly relax the blood vessels, the direct vasodilators, like hydralazine.
Yeah, these act straight on the smooth muscle cells in the walls of arterioles and sometimes veins, causing them to relax and widen. This directly reduces systemic vascular resistance.
How is hydralazine typically used?
It can be given orally for routine management of hypertension or intravenously for more severe urgent situations. It's also part of a specific combination product called Bidil.
Bidil? What's that?
That's hydralazine combined with isotretinoin. It has a specific indication as an adjunct therapy for heart failure, particularly in Black patients, who showed significant benefit in clinical trials.
Okay, but there's a vasodilator that comes with some really serious warnings, right? Sodium nitroprusside.
Oh, absolutely. Sodium nitroprusside is a very potent vasodilator, reserved only for severe hypertensive emergencies, and it's always given as a continuous IV infusion, usually in an ICU setting. It works incredibly fast, like within a minute or two.
What's the major risk associated with it?
The big danger is cyanide and thiocyanate toxicity.
Cyanide. Seriously?
Yes. A byproduct of its metabolism is cyanide, which the body normally detoxifies into thiocyanate, which is then cleared by the kidneys. But with prolonged infusions, high doses, or in patients with kidney problems, these toxic byproducts can build up to lethal levels.
Wow. So how do you present that?
Strict protocols. Very short infusion times are key. The sources emphasize never infusing for more than 10 minutes if possible, especially if renal function is iffy. Close monitoring for signs of toxicity is essential, and antidotes need to be readily available. It's considered a high-alert medication for a reason.
Okay, that's crucial. We should also quickly loop back to the calcium channel blockers, CCBs, and direct renin inhibitors, DRIs, we listed earlier but didn't detail.
All right, CCBs like amlodipine or nifedipine are another major class, also considered first line for many patients. They work by blocking calcium channels in vascular smooth muscle and the heart.
Blocking calcium prevents muscle contraction.
Exactly. Less calcium entering the smooth muscle cells of blood vessels means more relaxation, so vasodilation, and lower SVR. Some CCBs also slow the heart rate. They're particularly effective in elderly patients and, like thiazides, are often a good first-line choice for Black patients.
And the direct renin inhibitors, like aliskiren.
That's a smaller class.
Yeah.
Aliskiren works right at the very beginning of the RAAS cascade. It directly inhibits renin, the enzyme that starts the whole process of converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin I. So it stops the cascade before it even gets going.
Okay, we've covered a lot of drug mechanisms. Now let's bring it back to the nursing process and patient safety. This is where the rubber meets the road for students and practitioners. It starts with assessment, right?
Absolutely. A thorough baseline assessment is critical before starting any antihypertensive. We need vital signs, of course, BP, heart rate, respiratory rate, but also baseline labs.
What kind of labs?
You need electrolytes, especially potassium, given the risk of hyperkalemia with ACEs and ARBs. Renal function tests, BUN and creatinine, are vital, as many drugs affect the kidneys or are cleared by them. Liver function tests are important too, especially for drugs that are metabolized by the liver or are prodrugs, and a baseline blood count.
And you mentioned something earlier about checking the eyes.
Yes, the physical assessment should ideally include a non-invasive look at the fundus of the eye with an ophthalmoscope. Why? Because hypertension causes visible damage to the tiny blood vessels in the retina, over time, hypertensive retinopathy.
So looking at the eyes gives you a window into how well the blood pressure has been controlled long term.
Exactly. It's one of the best ways to gauge the effectiveness of therapy in preventing that underlying, often invisible, organ damage. It tells you if the treatment is really protecting those delicate structures.
Okay, moving to implementation. What's the single most important message for patients starting these drugs?
Adherence. Absolute adherence is mandatory. Hypertension doesn't usually make you feel sick day to day, so it's easy for patients to think, oh, I feel fine, I don't need this medicine. But the damage is happening silently. Treatment is almost always lifelong.
And tied into that is the risk of stopping abruptly, which we mentioned with clonidine, but it applies more broadly.
Yes, that warning about rebound hypertension isn't just for clonidine. While it might be most dramatic with centrally acting agents, abruptly stopping almost any antihypertensive can cause a sudden, dangerous spike in blood pressure. Patients must understand they should never stop their medication without talking to their provider, even if they feel better.
What about practical advice for minimizing side effects, like dizziness?
Orthostatic hypotension is a big risk, especially with alpha blockers and sometimes beta blockers or diuretics. Patients absolutely need to be taught to change positions slowly. Sit on the edge of the bed for a minute before standing, rise slowly from a chair, don't jump right up. This minimizes that lightheadedness and risk of falling.
And specific vital sign parameters to report.
Definitely. For patients on beta blockers specifically, they need to know to monitor their pulse and blood pressure. They should report a systolic BP consistently under 90 or a pulse rate consistently below 60 beats per minute to their provider right away.
What about identifying other red flags, things they need to call about?
They need to know the key potential side effects for their specific drug. Report that persistent dry cough if they're on an ACE inhibitor. Report any unusual swelling, especially facial swelling, immediately due to the angioedema risk with ARBs. Report signs that might suggest drug-induced lupus, like muscle or joint pain and fever if they're taking hydralazine. Any shortness of breath or dizziness, particularly with ARBs, needs reporting too.
And let's circle back one more time to that adherence issue, the sexual dysfunction problem.
Yes, it bears repeating because it's so common across almost all classes and is, according to the sources, the most common reason patients just stop taking their medication. We, as healthcare providers, need to create an environment where patients feel comfortable bringing this up.
Because there are often options, right? They don't just have to suffer or stop treatment.
Exactly. Sometimes adjusting the dose, switching to a different class of drug, or using combination therapy can mitigate that side effect. The key is open communication, so the provider knows it's an issue and can work with the patient to find a solution that maintains blood pressure control and quality of life. Stopping medication altogether is not the safe answer.
And finally, we should mention the non-drug approaches. Medication is key, but lifestyle matters too.
Immensely. Things like regular aerobic exercise, adopting the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, which is rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy, and achieving weight loss if overweight, are all evidence-based strategies that work synergistically with medications to improve blood pressure control.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a huge amount. The big picture is hypertension is defined by specific thresholds. It's basically cardiac output times SVR.
Right. And the drugs tackle that equation by hitting the nervous system centrally or peripherally, blocking the RAS cascade at different points, directly dilating vessels, or reducing fluid volume with diuretics.
And those critical safety takeaways? Watch for that first dose syncope with alpha blockers, the orthostatic hypotension risk overall, be vigilant about hyperkalemia with ACEs and ARBs, watch for the ACE cough and angioedema.
And absolutely never stop these drugs abruptly due to the risk of rebound hypertension. Adherence and communication are key.
So for a final thought to leave our listeners with, you mentioned looking at the eyes as a marker of long-term control. Why is that seemingly small detail so significant?
Well, think about it. Blood pressure readings can bounce around based on stress, activity, time of day. But the damage from chronic high pressure happens slowly, silently, deep inside. The tiny, delicate blood vessels in the retina are under that same pressure, 247. Seeing changes there, or hopefully seeing no changes over time, gives you tangible proof that the therapy isn't just lowering a number on a cuff, but is actually protecting the body's intricate structures from the relentless wear and tear of hypertension. It confirms the long game is working.
That really brings home the importance of sticking with it. A powerful way to end. Thank you so much for walking us through all this complex material from the sources.
My pleasure. It's crucial information to understand well.